let's just say I'm Acme Motors and I engage you, and I'm starting to look at what does a post-COVID world look? Do you get somebody from the healthcare practice, somebody from the payments practice, somebody maybe from emerging tropical diseases, and kind of say, okay, guys, we need to figure this problem out for Acme Motors. So when Acme Motors engages with you, they get the full resources of Deloitte with all the specialties?
That's a great question, Grayson. And what's interesting about it is that, and what I love about Deloitte is that we're thinking about all these different types of issues as it's happening, and we develop thought leadership around it. And so in particular with COVID, earlier this year, when we were at the start of the pandemic, Deloitte did join forces with Salesforce in determining what are the possible scenarios that could occur in a post-pandemic world when we're looking at 3 to 5 years in order to prepare for that. And the subset of that, my colleagues and I worked on a white paper focusing on would that have an implication on mobility. And when you break it down, there's two things to take into consideration. One is the impact of COVID-19 itself, the economic fallout, and then the intersection of the two in the sense of how that challenges mobility, transit systems, and so forth. We came up with 4 mobility scenarios. They are the passing storm, lone wolves, good company, and sunrise in the east. I'll give a very high overview in the sense of each one of them so you kind of get a flavor. The passing storm is pretty straightforward in the sense of the pandemic is contained effectively by governments without lasting and even economic repercussions. I think here we are about 8 months later. I think the passing storm is a scenario that we can't necessarily bank on at the moment. The lone wolf scenario is saying that a prolonged pandemic spurs government to adopt isolationist policies, shortening supply chain and increasing surveillance. While this necessarily gives greater authority for governments to combating COVID-19, it does have a reciprocal effect in the sense of cities having an impact on forced data sharing, regulating mobility to meet system-wide goals. So there's pros and cons to that. The good company scenario is an interesting one where it says governments around the world is struggling to handle the crisis. So this is where large companies step in to kind of set up key parts of the solution. So a great example is contact tracing. Private companies came up and offered solutions around contact tracing to be able to support and trying to mitigate, the spread of the virus. But how does that then have a reciprocal effect towards seamless transportation because of the fact that now we're setting precedent about opening up the sharing of mobility data potentially here. And then the final scenario is sunrise in the east. This one is interesting where while the rest of the world is trying to handle the pandemic, China and East Asian nations are becoming to take advantage of the fact of having a first stab in managing the virus. And so that will lead to other dominant potential repercussions in the sense of them dominating in various technological revolution, including in the mobility. So those are the 4 key scenarios that we've laid out. And there's a whole deep dive on Deloitte.com with respect to how we broke out in the relation to mobility. But there was 4 key no regret moves that came out of that. One is that there's going to be a lot more trip substitution via digitization. We see that already today in the sense of many people working from home, utilizing Zoom or any other form of video telepresence. And that will have an impact with telemedicine, will have an impact in the sense of, the movement of goods towards coming to home. There'll be more focus on safety. We've seen in the sense of how that has had an impact on airlines, private transit, even public transit, and those measures, and how does that change in the sense of density with respect to how many people can be in a train, for example. We've seen the impact on e-commerce that will continue to happen moving forth, and then also reconfiguring mobility landscape. One of the things that's been really interesting is that because of the time that many of us across the world were in shelter in place, it gave an opportunity for cities to revamp and reconfigure the mobility landscape. So here in San Francisco, not only have they ramped up on the bike lanes, but they've also implemented slow streets to reduce traffic flow in certain residential areas and changing the dynamic of how streets can be used. And then also the other thing to take into consideration is we see a lot more of these outdoor seating arrangements where parking spaces used to be. As you can imagine, in New York, that used to be such a big issue around Times Square before they like closed off pedestrian areas, and now that's become more of a commonplace. Now that's happening nationally. So those are the four key no regret moves that we think are going to be pretty evident regardless of the scenarios.